Hey, listeners, before we begin, a few important notes for this week's episode. This episode contains discussion of sexual violence, assault, and rape. If these topics don't feel right for you right now, we encourage you to skip this episode or come back to it at a time that feels correct. We also want to be clear when we talk about quote unquote problems with men, we're really talking about the system of patriarchy and the ways that it shapes behavior and harm. This is a heavy conversation, but an important one. This episode comes just after April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. But the work doesn't end when the month does. The conversations need to continue. We recently learned that many of our listeners identify as male. And while today's discussion may lean on an incorrect, binary, gendered language, we do invite all of you, especially those who identify as men, to listen with care, reflect, and also share this with someone you trust. Toxic masculinity impacts us all, and accountability means showing up for one another and working to change the systems we've inherited. Hey, Dr. Brett, I know you're well aware of it, given the programming at your institution and your job, that April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And I don't know if it is fitting, ironic, or just plain coincidence that recently CNN exposed a global online rape academy that was teaching millions of people how to drug and rape their spouses or partners. Basically, a hidden network of men sharing tips on how to assault women. It had over 60 million clicks or something like that. And I saw this headline and was both not surprised and also disgusted and angry, and still am. And honestly haven't seen a whole lot of reporting about it, which also kind of feels accurate given the way that we treat conversations around assault and accountability and victims. And I don't know if this is the totality of our patriarchy, toxic masculinities episode, but I think we need to look at the real numbers. I think we need to look at the real experiences and have a conversation about what this problem is and how men need to do better. This is the Doc to Doc podcast.
It's voice notes turned podcast. Place as perspective.
Welcome back, folks, to the Doc to Doc podcast. I'm Nicole, based in Washington, D.C., where presently, to my delight, it is rainy.
And I'm Brett, based in Southern California, where, to my delight, it is blue skies, but there's a little bit of a nip in the air. I stepped outside and had to put on my hoodie, and that was a delightful thing here at the end of April.
We are talking about toxic masculinity and men. And while the girlies are always welcome, the analytics tell us, the numbers tell us that actually a majority of our audience, which is surprising to me, identifies as male or masculine. So I think this is absolutely an episode for all of our listeners, but in particular, because we're calling out some pretty heavy themes based in toxic masculinity, I would absolutely encourage, we always encourage our listeners to share the pod if you find something that we've said is resonant with you. But I think this one is going to hit home in a lot of ways for people, or maybe in some unexpected ways. And I would absolutely encourage our audience members, which are men, to really take stock in what we're talking about today and send it to someone you know. Send it to a friend, a colleague. I think that it's heavy, but it's worth having the conversation, which is precisely why we're doing it today.
I don't know if this is exactly true yet, but we need to figure out a way to accurately collect this data. But from some anecdotal data over the last week, I think that we may have a overrepresentation of women utilizing YouTube to watch the pod. Some folks who have let me know that the way that they engage with the pod is by watching it on YouTube. And I think we get different data than we're able to gather on Spotify. So just curious. I'm not a quantitative researcher, so I will let others fill in those gaps for me.
Neither am I. But is it safe to say, despite having two non-quants in the room, had to take quantitative methods, learned it, hated it. So happy when the math part of my education was over.
Interestingly, I never took it, but I did have to teach it,
Well,
which you
probably better.
kind of knew. You might have known this. Like, we were friendly at this point in our careers at ASU. This was the second semester of our first year. I had to TA for a stats class. And I cried when I got that email because I had not taken a math class in, at that point, 18 years. And it was AP calculus in my senior year of high school.
Wow.
And I had never taken stats before. I am going to read a quote, maybe not this moment, but on the pod today, that I read to those students on the value of statistical data for social justice. And it
Mm.
is particularly relevant to our conversation today.
I also cry every time I had to take any kind of mathematics after a certain point. I'm happy to read a book for you all. Give me a time limit. I could really try that. If you ask me to solve an algebraic equation, I could probably do it, but I would not be happy. However, where I'm going with this, regardless of the qualitative brain, the numbers don't lie. What we're speaking about today is a universal phenomenon. It
Mm.
is something that happens everywhere across spectrums of politics, geography, orientation, and it is pervasive. So I don't know what the exact number is, she says, laughing through it because it's pretty fucking painful. But we are talking about toxic masculinity and specifically why men, but the majority of them seem to suck. I was talking to you about some of the numbers from the recent online rape academy, for example, were staggering that
Mhm.
millions upon millions of people were engaging with a platform designed to perpetuate violence. So those numbers are pretty shocking, and I don't really need a quantitative brain to acknowledge that.
Yeah, shocking numbers. I think and that folks wanted to debate the number of unique visitors versus return users, like as if it makes a fucking difference, but also the fact that it was users that were trying to identify ways to cause violence against their wives, girlfriends, partners, family members, probably like people within their intimate social circles. And I should say from the top, the vast majority of sexual violence happens against and amongst people who know each other. For fans of SVU, Criminal Minds, whatever the fuck, like all these different crime shows that make us believe that justice exists for survivors. Also, spoiler alert, it doesn't. But it also, these stories often are making us fear strangers. Not always, they've done 30 seasons, so obviously there's a range of stories, but a lot of the narratives in media are stranger danger. That's a lot of the narrative that's rooted in victim blaming and policing women's bodies and behaviors is fear of the stranger. But the reality, as this online rape academy is epitomizing, the vast majority of violence happens amongst people who know each other. They're in a relationship, a family, a social circle, they work together, they are acquaintances. And to have that highlighted in such a stark and like the casualness of some of these conversations that were leaked. I think as you and I were chatting a little bit before we started, it's not, I'm not numb because it never ceases to hurt. It's going to take something incredible to surprise me.
Mm,
I was not surprised that this is something that exists because I've been
yeah.
doing this work for too long and I haven't even been doing it very long compared to some of my mentors in this field.
Yeah, I was enraged by it. And when I shared it with friends who some had seen, some hadn't, primarily women, also received outrage and frustration, but nowhere was their surprise. And I think that's, yeah, it's easy to feel on one hand that maybe the way we're engaging today's conversation might feel a bit nihilistic at times or even desensitized. And I think there are elements to that because it is so pervasive. But I also want to be very clear that, yeah, it's not that there's a lack of care about it. In fact, it's a very deeply rooted care about this issue. But when something is constantly around you, it doesn't surprise you, but it doesn't make you any less infuriated or scared or just outraged. And so I think that's the through line. But the surprise, the shock, like, no, not there. Not there. Even as much as it is shocking in nature to be like, what the fuck again?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Because I think also for many folks they hear about that story and rightfully they picture the men, maybe they think about their own husbands, partners, brothers, fathers, folks who have caused them harm. And that's one of the reasons why it doesn't surprise me, because I think about any of the number of men who have disappointed me or who have hurt me or who have hurt people that I know and care about. But it hurts because I think about the young women that sit in my office as our participants, or when I meet with the advocates on my team, and we debrief, and it's their stories. That's
Yep.
why it never stops to hurt, because we know the impact, and that there's no flippancy to it. And men treat it so flippantly.
Yeah. And so that brings up something that maybe we can start with. I think throughout today's conversation, we're gonna sort of seesaw, if that's the right metaphor, between some theory and anecdote or just some things that are currently part of the social media sphere. And so one of these things is I sent you a video that has come across my feed pretty frequently from a clip of a podcast that I actually listened to, which is the Trevor Noah podcast. I think I've actually suggested that to folks before in season one, which was this interview back in February of this year with Dulce Sloan. And there's a particular viral quote where she's talking about, would women rather be alone in the woods or in the forest with a bear or a man? And it's surprising to men that most women tend to say that they would prefer to be in the woods with the bear.
Hmm.
I didn't, however, know that this was on social media more broadly until you told me. Like, my exposure point was this quote, and I want to talk about what Dolce says because I actually really appreciate the way that she's contextualizing this. But this is a social media thing too, or was? Like, how did you engage?
Yeah, it was. I'm not exactly sure. It was probably a question on a podcast, but I feel like it was one of those things that really blew up, or it was like a TikTok kind of like talk back, where someone was like responding to it. Because I feel like it was one of those things where there was a guy on a hike who had like a woman, I think, was passing him by
Mhm.
and he said hi. She didn't respond. And he was like super aggressive about it. And like, it was one of those things where like, I'm a nice guy. Like, why aren't you saying hi to me kind of a thing?
Yeah.
And then I think that's kind of how it blew up, where someone was like, and men wonder why women choose the bear. And it was like that kind of a thing. And then this conversation, so it became not like a meme, it became very conversational across different social medias of why women would choose the bear.
That's interesting. Maybe I have seen then a spin-off of this, which is I have seen a lot of the queers then posting on social that it's them walking past a woman on a hike or a street, and their entire prerogative is trying to reassure women that they're not a threat by saying the most ridiculous things, like
Yes.
playing Lady Gaga really loud, just like a flamboyancy to
Yeah.
demonstrate a non-threatening persona. So it sounds like maybe they're related, but I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly it. It's ways of trying to cue to folks that you're
So then I highly recommend, I'm going to place it in the show notes because I don't want to take credit for it. And even though we're discussing it, I do think it's worth a watch. It's about 10 minutes. In this conversation, Trevor Noah has Dulce Sloan on, and there's this provocation. Would you rather be alone with a bear or a man in the woods? And, without any stop, she's like, the bear, 1,000%. There's two men interviewing her on the podcast, and they're both kind of like, oh, wait, hold on. Let's qualify this. Why do you want to hang up there? Bears are dangerous, blah, blah, blah. And she says, I think at the beginning, something like, well, I know what each of them want if I'm with them. Like, the bear wants food. I have to give the bear food, or I have to give the man my pussy. And it's
Yeah.
like immediately in the context of harm. And I think that what she does a really good job explaining is talking about all of the ways that women are taught to protect themselves, to sort of arm themselves against the proclivities of other men. I talked about that even a few weeks ago on the pod of talking about this chair metaphor. It's like you have to do all of this work to ensure that you are not the reason for a man committing a particular act. Dress this way, carry a knife with you, carry pepper spray, keep your keys in your hand when you walk to the car. Don't walk alone. Always, have a backup. There's all of these sort of
Yeah.
tokens or talisman that women carry depending where they are to ensure that if they get accosted by someone that they're not hurt. Like I carry pepper spray with me, and that's not just because I live in a city. Like I always have something. You're always looking for the exits. You're constantly negotiating space. This is a constant negotiation of, is this space for me? Who is occupying it with me? And am I safe? And she talks about this of, you tell women to do all of this stuff, but then when they are attacked, you don't believe them. But you told me to do all of this stuff to protect myself from a violence that was inevitable. And yet at the same time, and I think connecting this back to the online rape academy, what you were speaking before, you say, do all of this, protect yourself. Then I tell you something happened. You tell me, I don't believe you, but you told me to equip myself. And then when we go to look for who actually is perpetuating this, everyone claims that they don't know anyone or they never knew that person in that capacity. But no one around us can find who these men are who are perpetuating it. But we acknowledge that it's everywhere because you've told me to arm myself. And yet at the end of the day, nobody actually knows anyone who that we can hold to account because it's not there. So what is it? So of course, for her, and I would say the same thing, I would absolutely choose the animal. I would rather take my chances with a wild animal because I understand their motivations as clearly as I understand the motivations of most men.
That when it comes to, to Dulce's point about, we carry pepper spray, there's the little like pokey things that look like a cat that you put on your keychain. These are all like what we in the biz call, these are all harm reduction strategies, but they're also victim blaming strategies and tools because the onus of responsibility is on women, queer folks who are vulnerable to men's violence to make actions to prevent the violence that would happen to them. We are not doing the same things to teach men not to rape or to encourage men not to rape. And when I was an advocate in Minnesota, one of my advocacy mentors, her name was Kathy T. Tragically, we lost her too soon. Just incredible person. She had a quote that just absolutely stuck with me, where she said, harm reduction strategies are just to ensure that somebody else gets raped because it does nothing about the conditions or the structures or the person who is on raping.
Yeah.
But if you do enough things, you are ensuring that it's not you and that instead they will target someone else who is not as well prepared. Well, I alluded to it earlier when I was trying to, in many ways, psych myself up to teach a stats class that I felt ill prepared to do. I needed to, in some ways, find value in it for myself as someone who is not a quantitative researcher. In many ways, leading up to that point, I had already done some work critiquing the use of statistics. We often, particularly around sexual violence, we know that SV and TV is underreported for a number of reasons. That's often structural. That's often because the folks who are vulnerable to violence are often vulnerable not only to interpersonal violence, but also systemic and structural. So folks are not going to go to systems that are also victimizing them. Queer folks are not necessarily going to go to the police for protection. Women aren't going to go to the police for protection. Undocumented folks are not going to go to the state for protection. The academy is not doing research on survivors in general. It's not doing research on folks of color. Interestingly, in a flip, because usually the academy is only interested in men when it comes to most fields, except when it comes to sexual and domestic violence, the academy is not interested in men who are victims. And so when we look at data on men and masculine folks as survivors, if you go to like RAIN's website, you're going to find data from 1999. And so that shows men survivors that they're not legible and therefore likely their victimization doesn't really matter. How do we provide services for folks who are made invisible by our culture? So through all of this critique, I was having to think about how do I work with these young scholars? And I was reminded of this speech given by Andrea Dworkin, who is a queer lesbian. I think she identified as radical feminist. I do not align with all of her positions and all of her politics. As a radical feminist, she took some stances, particularly on like pornography, that were of a particular time. She was a scholar in the 80s, which is a particular time in feminist scholarship that was formative for the field, but dated at this point, limited.
Yeah.
But she did a speech in that was called I Want a 24-Hour Truce in Which There Is No Rape. I'm going to read two paragraphs, and it is particularly relevant to our conversation today. And it begins. And also that we do not have time. We women, we don't have forever. Some of us don't have another week or another day to take time for you to discuss whatever it is that will enable you to go out into those streets and do something. We are very close to death. All women are. And we are very close to rape. And we are very close to beating. And we are inside a system of humiliation from which there is no escape for us. We use statistics not to try to quantify the injuries, but to convince the world that those injuries even exist. Those statistics are not abstractions. It's easy to say the statistics, somebody writes them up one way and somebody writes them up another way. That's true, but I hear about the rapes one by one, by one, by one, by one, which is also how they happen. Those statistics are not abstract to me. Every 3 minutes, a woman is being raped. Every 18 seconds, a woman is being beaten. There is nothing abstract about it. It is happening right now as I am speaking. And it is happening for a simple reason. There is nothing complex and difficult about the reason. Men are doing it because of the kind of power that men have over women. That power is real, concrete, exercised from one body to another body, exercised by someone who feels he has a right to exercise it, exercised in public and exercised in private. It is the sum and substance of women's oppression. And the problem is that you think it's out there, and it's not out there. It's you. And that just hits me like a truck.
Yeah.
Every time I read it, I think it's interesting because it also connects with how the Trevor Noah clip starts, because Dulce talks about how being a woman is being close to death, because that's what existing means, because it is always that threat, because that is what living in patriarchy means. We've talked, I think, similarly, that's what living in white supremacy means for Black folks, for folks of color, that these are systems of death.
I don't know the exact clip, but I'll find it and also link it in the show notes. But there is a scene from a television show or a movie where um, this woman is talking about what are the biggest fears of men versus
Oh,
women.
yes.
And the group is asked, like, for men, like, oh, what is the biggest thing that you fear about women? And the men respond that they'll laugh at us. When women are asked the same thing about men, it's that they'll kill us. It feels so right, because it's like, what is the thing that if I think about that I am most scared of in those moments where, I'm surveilling myself, I'm trying to protect myself because I anticipate violence. And it is that violence that, of course, is linked to sexual assault, which is the power negotiation, is that I know that there will be harm that will likely lead to death. I just think it's really telling. And I think it even links to a larger conversation, maybe these online communities of
Mm-hmm.
masculinities, or, the response to some of this, which has been the rise of incel culture or looks maxing or these other platforms for men, which are in themselves wrapped around toxic masculinity. But it all seems to be this response of not being good enough, or being shamed, or being laughed
Mm-hmm.
at. But what is more harmful, being laughed at or dying? The stakes are higher for approximately half of us, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because in those couple minutes, which I think there's so much content in those 5 minutes, which, as Nicole mentioned, we will put in the show notes, in that conversation with Dulce and Trevor Noah. She talks about how there is that like deflection for men of, hashtag not all men, or, that's not me. There's that defensiveness. And I was trying to also think about, like, how do I situate myself, or like what are my reactions, thinking about like when there's critique of like white folks. Often, like, I don't internalize that. It's easy for me to critique whiteness and not feel any of that defensiveness. And I feel like that sometimes I do feel like when there is sort of blanket critique of men, I feel it come up for me. There's sometimes like that disconnect between how I know and how I think about it. And like that sort of habitual response feeling. And I think that some of it is because of the work that I have done around masculinity.
Brett, that question or even that self reflection of like not all men or what comes up for you, or even, if I think about that of, oh, that wouldn't be my partner or that wouldn't be this person that's close to me. I think we should talk through that. We'll get into some of the theory because I actually think this for our listeners is very well aligned with some of the more academic, heady way to describe this. But I think it gives us the language to think through that. But what about ism? Yeah, I'll be right back. All right, and we're back. So, Brett, I'd like to provide an opportunity for you to talk a little bit about what you're saying prior to the break of your reaction of saying, well, that's not me, or maybe I've experienced this, or that whataboutism that I think also to the Dolce Sloan, she also brings up because Trevor Noah does provide a little bit of a what about in the
Mhm.
context not of gender but in the context of race and ethnicity, that even for example with the Black Lives Matter movement there was a lot of backlash that we've seen about, well, what about this kind of life or blue lives? Do you
Mhm.
not mean that this also matters? And it has me thinking a little bit about your work. I'm curious how maybe you're thinking about that as both an individual response to being maybe felt like you're being called out in that way because of how you present or how you're part of who's being called out. And maybe you could take us through that, but also take us through some more of the theory, which I think provides a better explanation for like it's not just an individual one versus one versus one. There's something in totality that needs to
Mhm.
be explored further to fully understand that and also understand why that can feel like an accusation that's maybe misplaced or maybe dead on, but either way creates a visceral response.
There is a tension that we feel, even if it's not inherently our identity. Like when there are talk about men, even if I struggle with whether I even identify as a man. Generally, I identify as genderqueer, but there is still I identify as mostly masculine, or sometimes, it's gender is a fluid thing. But I appreciated the conversation with Dulce and Trevor. And when he brought up with race and Black Lives Matter, well, don't all lives matter? And well, what about don't Asian lives matter
Hmm.
or Latin lives? And I don't think that a race analysis and a gender analysis, like it's not a one-to-one sort of conversation, which I think does come out in their discussion. But also here, in the way that I'm sort of looking at it, is that some of my struggle comes from the analysis work that I've done. But some of it also comes from having experienced the violence of men in how I have been gendered,
Mm.
or come to my own masculine gendered identity, where masculinity is about creating hierarchies. And like we've talked about over the last, couple weeks, I think, in some of the pod episodes, where masculinity is about performing for and at the expense of other men. And because of that, it's men really are not a monolith, even if men benefit from patriarchy. It is
Mm.
still this aspiration that men are all competing for, because it is not something that all men can achieve equally. So there's a tool that we use in gender theory. Folks may have encountered this before, and we will link it in the show notes because it is fairly visual, but it's also pretty simplistic. When I use this as a teaching tool, we kind of go through steps to like elicit things from the audience. And I will share that like I've been doing the same activity for 15 years now, like across generations. And I've sort of wondered if it would stop being relevant, like with increasingly Gen Z audiences. And I'm finding that it's not yet.
Mm.
Um, so it's called the man box. It begins with a square. And I ask folks, think about like a young boy, or like a youth, or like high school, kind of like not yet an adult. What are traits, behaviors, hobbies, favorite things of a young boy, a youth, high school? and they'll say plays with trucks, sports, aggressive, rolling around in the dirt. Favorite color is blue. High school, maybe they're starting to party, beginning to get interested in girls, roughhousing. They want to be like the captain of the football team, fairly ubiquitous things.
Mhm.
And then I'll say, okay, now think about college, young adult, partying, drinking excessively. Maybe they're in a fraternity, they're sleeping around, their major is finance, like,
Looking
and
for a man in
sometimes
finance.
and sometimes in order to prompt this question, sometimes we'll ask very directly, like when I say man up or be a man, what comes to mind? If I want to be more subtle, we'll ask those like kind of leading questions to think about the lifespan to kind of build up to it. Sometimes we ask it direct out. Be a man, what comes to mind? Don't show emotions. Don't cry. You have to be the breadwinner. You're the protector. You are heterosexual, those kinds of things, like you're physically fit, those things. And all of those words and concepts we write inside of the box. And then I ask folks, okay, now particularly let's think about junior high, high school. If you have a boy, young man who is not fulfilling these traits, what are some of the words or names that they might be called? And I say, I'm going to ask you to say some words and phrases that are not nice, but it's
Mm.
important that we name them. Pussy, fag, sissy, mama's boy, bitch, cuck. There's like more Gen Z versions of them, but all of those like derogatory terms, slurs, they all come out. And I say, can you see a commonality in a lot of these things? And sometimes folks are hesitant to say it, but you can often see they're thinking it. It's words and phrases that are related to women's bodies, names that women are called, or homosexual men.
Yeah,
So
something effeminate in terms
the
of yeah, right.
Yes. So what it is implying is that for a man to be considered less than ideal, that is to be a woman or it is to be gay. So
Yeah,
not only is that sending a particular message to boys and men, it is also sending a message to girls and women and queer folks about where they stand in our social and cultural hierarchy. So it is sending a generalized message about who is valued in our culture. And I say, okay, so now we have this inner box of what it means to be a man. We have these ways of shaming and trying to correct behavior for folks who are not engaging in that way. How might we expect folks to act or react if they are failing to live up to these expectations? They're being called these names. How might they act or react? And folks will say, maybe they bully vulnerable folks. Maybe they lash out. Maybe they overcompensate by like over partying. Maybe they act out with violence. They engage in intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual violence. They use substances or they engage in self-harm. And that is a reinforcing cycle of violence. And that is the man box. And that is how we keep men in this very rigid structure of what it means to be a man in our culture. And then utilizing the work of Joe Ehrman, who has a fantastic TED Talk. It's only about 15 minutes. We'll link it in the show notes. He talks about the three pillars of toxic masculinity. I think he phrases it a little bit differently. The way I've used it is to talk about the three pillars, which is sexual conquest of women, athletic ability, which I've expanded upon to also include like physical prowess or domination in general and our like ability to dominate, which
Mm.
I include as being like online incel cultures or even like gaming culture, I think aligns with the same ethos of athletic ability. And then the third is financial success. The more I talk about these, the more I think I need to move away from pillars because pillars are fixed structures. But actually, these three barometers of what it means to be a man are actually, like I said before, these are finish lines in a race that are constantly moving and are constantly moving out of reach. And they're continually being made unattainable so that men are always striving for more. We're never having enough sexual partners. We're never earning enough money. And we never have a good enough title. Our bodies are constantly deteriorating. So we always have to keep working on them. We always have to keep winning more championships or whatever it is. And so built into those aspirations is failure because we are never going to be enough. And when we fail, we get angry. And as
Mhm.
Bell Hooks tells us, the only acceptable emotion that men are allowed to feel is anger, because historically that anger was channeled into sending men off to war to fight for the imperialist nation. But now my argument, since I wrote my master's thesis 10 years ago that I talked about recently, because we're sending fewer men off to war, instead, we're utilizing that anger to send men into the boardroom to conquer others financially. And we are also doing it now with technology, where
Mhm.
we are dehumanizing one another. We are destroying the environment, and the toll does not matter as long as we are making more money. And that is toxic masculinity.
Yeah, man, all roads really do lead back to bell hooks sometimes. I'm thinking about their book, which I don't think we mentioned on the pod, We Real Cool, which also speaks to toxic masculinity and the intersection of masculinities and ethnicity. And I think this barometer thing to me is interesting because it's very Foucauldian. Outward violence in this expression from something like engaging in war, although technically we are at war again,
Yep.
but at mass scale, to then how do you move that into something that is maybe more permissible and quieter and more socially acceptable? Like, maybe not Jordan Belfort, Wolf of Wall Street nonsense, but if you're successful in this business financial arena, that's considered, uh, pretty admirable, I think, because it relates to your ability to provide and to be seen as a successful business person. But I would also say, like, with Gen Z and Alpha, is also this entrepreneurial, almost online ification of it as well. That, I don't know is how many of these people actually see themselves as being in the boardroom necessarily, although it's part of it. But you mentioned a lot of these people being related to domination and online cultures. And for podcasters and streamers and people that are engaged in this digital platform,
Mhm.
how you are perceived through this social media apparatus is really interesting as well as it evolves.
Because even, and I know we're going to get into a little bit of it today, but like for listener, I always want to say for readers,
For readers. For
for
readers of
listeners,
the
like,
transcript.
yeah, which is how I engage with a lot of podcasts. I read the transcript. This is not our AI episode, but
No.
like for a lot of influencers and stuff, you can buy engagement and
Uh-huh.
you can buy artificial likes, comments, things like that. And these data farms are going to cause us all to die of thirst. And that, like, leveraging your short term success at the expense of the world, that is patriarchy.
Yeah.
Like, it is the same root.
So I do have a question. It might be a long form question because it's a Nicole question. So
Hmm. Let me get my
uh,
pen ready.
can't apologize for who I am, but if you know, you know.
Yeah. Well, we haven't before. Why start now?
So as you describe the be a man box or this man box and the expectations and the constant movement of that finish line, and the reaction is being really angry. On one hand, I feel very deeply sympathetic to that. I also feel empathetic in that I think for women there is similar boxes where we can put ourselves in a similar exercise and say, like, what are all the ways that we're failing? And I would not in any way want to characterize this as that women do not perform violence towards one another, because they do. But maybe it's a two-part question. One, why is it that when men get angry, they get violent? And when women get angry, having maybe the same, or I would say even the added pressure of the responsibility for men, which is the second part of my question, why there are different outcomes statistically, even
Mm.
though this is not a stats class. But then also, I'm curious about that. I'm sympathetic to that. I appreciate that pressure that men have amongst themselves and against this sort of Sisyphus-like struggle to achieve true masculinity. But then I feel angry and enraged personally, and I've also experienced this, and I think we experience toxic masculinity and patriarchy, that it is still often the burden of women to take on the responsibility to fix this. Even to my own experience of having to dress a particular way, having to take all these precautions to assume that men won't be violent towards me or to try to ensure that they won't. feels like I can really be deeply sympathetic and even empathetic to an extent of that struggle. I don't relate to the violence of it, which is not to say that it doesn't exist in my intersection of identity. But then this is still something that I think women have to take on the majority of the labor to fix. And I don't know why that is the case, but it certainly is something where that empathy kind of it doesn't stop, but it kind of makes me not like men as much, right? Because I can do all this labor for myself, but then I'm still expected to sort of mother you into fixing it as well. Yeah.
I think there absolutely is a woman box or, like a femininity box. And a few episodes ago, when I talked about the tree and I
Mhm.
defined patriarchy as the cultural and social system that asserts that men are the natural head of the household, the nation state, and the company. And so what that is also asserting is that men's rightful place is of the public sphere. And so when men feel aggrieved, they claim space, they claim public space. And this was a significant argument of my master's thesis that I was not yet a geographer, yet I was making a geographic argument now that I think about it. And I was trying to, in some ways, understand mass shooters and actually want to correct last week. I had was said that my master's thesis was in part grounded in the shooting conducted by Dylan Roof, and it was actually Elliot Rodger. But as that exemplifies that there were just so many of them that it was interchangeable. It was difficult to keep these stories straight because there were just so many of them. And it exemplifies that most mass shootings, whether it was in a school, a movie theater, that often there was some form of violence in their home first, some form of domestic violence, where a family member was killed, and then they went out into the public sphere because uh, that is men claiming ownership of the space that they are told is theirs. Men feel aggrieved or that they are not given their entitlement. They're claiming it through the only means that they are told is truly masculine, which is violence. And this is one of the things that I talk about with my dad, that he was raised to believe that his worth as a father and as a partner is demonstrated by how much money he was making. And when he struggled, because he was a salesman working on commission, for a long time, I was trying to write something called My Father is Willie Loman, named
Uh,
after Death of a Salesman, because
yeah.
that is his story. He lied. His lies come from his felt sense of failure to earn the money that he felt made him a success. And he destroyed his relationships because of money, because he was raised to believe that money determines his value rather than the quality of his relationships. And that is toxic masculinity. And his violence was psychological, is psychological. And so men are using the tools that they have been told are the embodiment of masculinity. And when we think about self harm, we engage in acts of self harm at higher rates. Coming back to stats, women and femme folks engage in rates of self harm at higher rates than men and masculine folks do. But men and masculine folks complete acts of suicide at higher rates because they use more lethal methods, in part because of the shame of failing.
Mm. So I want to talk about this online academy. I also want to talk a little bit about social media and AI. One of the immediate responses online to this was the kind of nice guys that were coming out of the woodwork of being like, oh, that would never be me.
Mm.
Or like, and I have a daughter or I have, a sister. And it's like immediately bringing out of the associations that people have to women in their lives, which I think is bullshit.
It shouldn't require any of.
You don't need to have a personal connection to another being to be able to like have empathy, or you shouldn't, right? Like that
Yeah.
shouldn't be the way you negotiate that, is through your relationships. But there was all this nice guy logic that was coming out, which all of the times that the same people that were perpetuating violence towards me or other people were also the loudest at reminding us that they were nice people, and that they, of course they wouldn't be.
Mm.
They were nice guys. You should take that. They're a nice guy underneath all of this. You're making it more difficult. But then the other part of that, my partner brought this up. They retracted this, but they also brought up that when I originally posted on social media, one of the early reports about saying, however many 60 plus million, maybe 62 million people involved in this, that was also reflected in the comment section was, well, this is misleading because it implies that there were 62 million active members of this academy. And that
Unique users or
unique
whatever,
users,
right? Yeah.
exactly what you're saying at the top, right? Whereas actually those numbers are different, or we don't know that. And so this is a false sort of statement. I want to bring this up because this feels like kind of a tactic of this obfuscation of responsibility by saying, well, this isn't actually true, or, maybe we don't deny that this is horrible, but there is a strategy in creating caveats, especially in online spaces. It feels like this is really amplified because everyone has the power to comment and like and share and present in different ways, where there becomes this sort of unclear impact that it is minimized, like what we're trying to focus our anger on and trying to focus the story should be that this is appalling and there needs to be something done about this. But then it just kind of gets clouded by all this online noise.
Yeah. Well, because I think, not to justify any of the like caveats, but I can see how the minimizing of it gets cloudy. Because there are times even with like social where someone will post something, and if it's like heavy and if I like it, I'm like, that feels weird to like this thing that's heavy, but
Mhm.
I'm trying to show you that I see it, or
Right.
that I'm, trying to, I don't know what I'm trying to do by I'm valid, And
Yeah.
so just does giving traffic, is traffic consent? Is traffic mean usage? Like there are all these ways that we can minimize, like, I don't know, but that's taking us away from the point here of that this thing exists.
So then the other part that was also enraging about this, and I I want to be clear that I'm not trying to say that one particular news story is full of more harm than another, because I think there are plenty of news stories right now that do not get the attention that they should. And so I'm not trying to minimize the spatial real estate of the news cycle than
Mm,
something like Lebanon or Palestine. But I was very frustrated and enraged that I had to keep sharing this with people. This seemed to fly under the radar even
yeah.
now, talking about it. I don't actually know how many of our listeners will be familiar with this. I highly recommend that you look into the investigative reporting that has been done. And it was very extensive by these journalists. Like it should be more shocking, and yet this comes back to this point that it's like it's so pervasive that it's not shocking. But then I also think that
And that we moved on. I think there's something about it was so not shocking that it didn't even last a full news cycle.
right. So then, and I don't think this is unrelated, it leads me to this question of the embedded masculinities into digital culture. If that's something that we should just assume is there and move on, or I mean, is the environment itself such that it's already a structure that supports and provides legitimacy to this kind of behavior, such that it also would be the same kind of structure that would protect it from having that kind of accountability, because it is in this digital space that we can move on, or it's part of a news cycle that is so fast at this point that there's not sustained attention on it, despite how important it is and should be brought to our attention.
I think one of the it's not only a post pandemic reality. I think this is very much a post, even though it's not post, but this is a Trumpian reality, that our attention spans are very short because we are inundated with chaos and violence and horrors. And that's part of the intention, is that we it's so difficult to organize against anything, or for anything, because it's just one thing after another, and that's been their game plan. But it does also mean that things like this, that even have nothing to do with him supposedly, are not given the weight that they deserve. But I think that we are not giving, I don't know if, I think it's maybe we don't know what to do yet with some of these digital platforms, even though like a online forum is one of our oldest forms of digital platforms. As a child who came up on AOL chat groups,
Yes.
and instant messenger, the more harmful direction is thinking about like AI chatbots and the way that those are playing into toxic masculinity. And interestingly, John Oliver just did a whole episode talking about AI chatbots and how they are built upon sycophantic relationships and just feeding you validation and telling you basically what you want to hear, and that convincing you that you're brilliant, that you're groundbreaking, or that whatever idea you have, you should run with it, even if that idea is dying by suicide. And that they will tell you that the noose you've just created is a beautiful noose and is very effective. And there are some horror stories in that piece. And there is no accountability from these fucking ghouls who are creating these platforms that, like I said earlier, are not only going to make us all die of thirst, but are also going to convince us to kill ourselves along the way.
Well, it's that obscurity again in this case of accountability, because if you are engaged in a chat, and yeah, there's evidence for this. We've seen how this has directly impacted the way that people take their own lives or even are influenced to perpetuate shootings and other acts of violence. The accountability could be that you as the individual are prompting, but then the sycophantic nature of these things, maybe we need a law doctor to come on,
Mm.
a proper JD to talk about this, but then how you hold the systems accountable, because essentially it's just code. It's not an individual person. Although in my research, myself and others speak to how technology are tools of their are reflections of their creators. I mean, there is a person who ultimately is coding behind all of this. So the tools that we're using are, I think, absolutely a direct reflection of the values that we have as human creators behind them. So they're not neutral in that sense. And yet the accountability to figure out, like, how do you, one, maybe program out the toxic masculinity, if maybe that's the solve that someone decides, is that even possible when underneath that, as a society, we still haven't actually programmed that out of ourselves? That
Right.
it's still something that we assume is both an individual responsibility, as we've talked about, but we also obfuscate that accountability that, I don't know, like, that couldn't be me because I have a sister or I have this or I have that, or I don't know anyone in my circle, or, oh, he was a nice guy. And at the end of the day, I think we're operating in a space that's similar to the academy online. And I'm using academy because that's their own terminology, is a place that ultimately provides legitimacy to these people who are enacting. I mean, people went online to learn how to assault the people in their lives, and they were provided cachet and legitimacy and credentials by learning from other people, endorsement from other people. Oh, you should do this, try that. A community, or I think people actually felt really emboldened to do that because there was this echo chamber that said, this is fine, you should do this, or do it better. But then you also have these technologies that are sycophantic, that, like, I've sent you this meme where it's like, most funnily is that, like, Lord of the Rings, Bilbo Baggins being like, with the ring, like, why shouldn't I keep it? And then chat is like, of course, Bilbo, you should keep the ring, blah, blah, blah. And then it's like end of the fellowship right there. And that's funny. And like anyone who's interacted with the chat bots, it's like ridiculous how quickly they're like, you're right, you should, blah, 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 blah. But it's also incredibly harmful because it's yet another mechanism that both obfuscates this accountability, but also provides this license to continue and like this encouragement. And so I don't think our episodes we ever want to say, oh, we have the solve for something that we're trying to critique. But I am really curious, Brett, because you were engaged with people, teaching them how to think through these things, how to work through this kind of harm. What are those conversations with students? What are you thinking about? Where is the direction of, yet again, another tool to contribute to this like sea of toxic masculinity, as opposed to draining it and starting with something different?
Yeah, it was a question that I struggled with for a while. And one of the things that I have come to, and that I tell folks when I do this training, I said, I will leave you with a little bit of lightness. And I said, the reason that I continue to do this work is because I do fundamentally believe that we all can make a difference in undermining the culture of violence, like the tree that we talked about a few weeks ago. And, I say that we talked about the man box. This is the idea of masculinity that we have all inherited. So we didn't ask for it, similar to the culture of violence. We didn't ask for it. It's not our fault. But again, we have a responsibility for what we do with this version of masculinity. Do we uphold it? Do we valorize it? Do we continue to gender our children this way? And it is men and women and queer folks often too that are upholding that vision. Women often play into it as well. That's not to blame folks, but it's sometimes like that's what we know. And until we see the wizard behind the curtain, we don't know it until we know it. And so instead, I offer folks, I call it a man / non-binary, something like amorphous blob. So it's like a thing for every individual person. So instead of there being one rigid shape that everyone has to fit into, there is, this amoeba that's unique to every possible individual. And instead of there being rigid ways of being inside, there's more fluid ways of being. There's emotionfulness, like expansiveness. There's empathy. There's care, being emotionally intelligent. There's being dedicated to a cause, which is something that Joe Ehrman talks about in his TED Talk. There's being invested in relationships instead of being individualistic. There's collaborative, empathic. And then on the side, instead of having those traits being shamed with derogatory terms and slurs, it's being validated and reinforced with hearing things like, you matter, I support you, I respect you, telling folks that they're loved for being who they are. And then when folks have that reinforcement, instead of acting and reacting with violence and self-harm, they react by leaning into care, empathy, partnership, nonviolence, and acting from places of agency. And these are all small acts that we can engage in every day in our lives because we are interacting with folks who have vulnerabilities, who have insecurities, and we can support and validate folks in our lives across the gender spectrum. This is not just about how we support men, but this is how we support every relationship that matters to us in our lives. And this is how, when I talk about in my work and in my life, creating cultures of care and well-being, this is how we do it. This is how we create cultures of accountability interrelationally. And this is how we do our homework day to day.
I feel like I'm going to plant the seed here, Dr. Brett, that I almost feel like we'll need to do a part 2 to this, have a follow-up to this. I have questions immediately. I have reactions, but I would also invite our listeners, if you would be interested, if you also have questions or reactions to today's episode, write them in the comments. Would love to engage in this further and see how people are digesting this, because I do think we've noted that there was an absence in some ways of a conversation around some of these things that have happened recently in the news cycle. But I also know that this is something that has a deep cut. So with that, write a comment, give us a reaction, a provocation, a thought, and maybe we'll return to this at a later time in the season.
Welcome back, folks. We are now going to close the episode, as we close every episode, with our signature segment, More Comment Than a Question. And as always, no, we're not taking follow-ups. So I've mentioned recently on the pod that I've started seeing a nutritionist. It has been going well, although kind of just getting going. And my comment this week is that, unsurprisingly to many listeners, I'm sure, healthcare in US America is broken. My appointments are now on pause because what I thought were covered appointments are not. And I received almost $1,000 worth of bills over the weekend. And so now I'm trying to get things that were approved, reapproved, trying to go through reauthorizations, have to get estimates on how many appointments I need for ongoing approvals. And so until that is worked out, I'm supposed to have an appointment this morning before Dr. Nicole and I started to record, had to cancel that last minute. So frustrating that even when we start to feel good about things that have been ongoing chronic concerns and mental illnesses for, let's say, 32 years, because of the folks who love to make money, we can't make progress in our lives. So fuck that shit.
Okay, my more of a comment than a question this week. So I'm not here to shame anyone about what they want to wear, how they want to express themselves. I'm a millennial, so I've
Mm,
grown up where the majority of my time, particularly in the mid aughts, has just been body shaming and every kind of shaming as it relates to physical appearance. But my caveat to this is if I see someone have a coat, be it a blazer, a trench coat, or any kind of coat, and you know what I'm talking about, at the back of a coat, when you buy it, there is a little X at the back of it that
mm,
you're supposed to cut. I was on the subway this morning and I was behind someone on the escalator, and this person had a very nice coat that I immediately was like, this person doesn't know how to wear their clothes because they didn't cut it.
mm,
I see this, I immediately shame people. That's not necessarily my comment, although I guess it is my comment. Like if I see it, I am going to be like, yo, you don't know how to dress yourself. But I think at this point, enough people have not figured this out that I think manufacturers need to legitimately, as they do with a tag in internal that gives you the price tag, I think there needs to now be a tag on these that just says, please cut this, or this is
mm,
meant to be cut. Because not, this is, it's probably 60% of the people who buy a new coat never do this. So either we need an awareness campaign, a la that train campaign, like Dumb Ways to Die from Australia, or like I think manufacturers need to step up because people like me are just going to silently be like, they don't know how to dress themselves.
mm. One thing that reminds me of to give
What? No comments.
this is, and it's an addendum. I do really love now that that manufacturers have made the tags on the back of shirts and stuff like really easy to rip off.
Okay.
Have you noticed that on sweatshirts and like
I've always
and
cut them
t-shirts?
out. So
Well, yeah, but you've had to cut them, but now they're like easy to rip out
no, maybe
because
I
when you
don't know. I'm
cut
so
them, they
about
leave little pokey things.
I feel like you have just broken the rules. This is like we can do
We've
addendums
done that
now.
a few times. Anyways, thank you all for tuning in this week. We know this was a heavier episode. If you had any thoughts, any lingering questions, please drop that in the comments. As Dr. Nicole said, we are likely going to do a follow-up. So if there are questions or thoughts that you would like to share with us or that you would like us to potentially address in a part 2, please feel free to reach out. Make sure to smash that like and subscribe button. It does mean a lot to us. If there are folks that you think would be challenged, would be validated, would be supported, would be provoked by this episode, definitely send it their way. And tune in next week when we're going to have uh, uh, a lighter episode where Dr. Nicole and I are going to talk about music, talk about
Mhm.
concerts, maybe shit on Ticketmaster and Live Nation a little bit, and talk about what we're looking forward to coming up in the world of jazzy tunes. So tune in next week, and we'll talk to y'all soon. Doc to Doc is co-hosted, written, produced, and edited by us, Dr. Brett S. Goldberg and Dr. Nicole K. Mayberry. Our original music was written and performed by Matt Bogdanow, and our original artwork was illustrated by Andre Gonzalez. Doc to Doc is an independent podcast and a conversation across place, perspective, and friendship. We record Doc to Doc between Washington, D.C. and Orange County, California. In Washington, D.C., we record on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank Anacostans, also known as the Anacostan or Nacotchtank peoples, and near the lands of the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. In Orange County, we record on the traditional and unceded lands and waters of the Hashiman and Tongva tribal nations.